Hello everyone, welcome to tonight. We are the Sophia Society. We're a student-run organization that focuses on making academic events such as these to help pursue wisdom within the student body. And so tonight we would like to thank Dr. Randy Boyagoda for joining us. He's a professor at U of T, and you'll hear a little bit more of him later on. But right now I'd like to introduce our introducer for the evening. Natasha Duquette is a professor and a chair of English here at Tyndale. She's edited 3 books, including the essay Subliminal Aspects, Interfaces Between Literature, Aesthetics, and Theology. She's currently serving as an editor-in-chief for the Palgrave Macmillan Encyclopedia of Romantic Era Women's Writing, and is writing a series on meditations on ethics and novels and prayer of Jane Austen, which is forthcoming in the press in 2019. So I'd like to call her up to introduce Dr. Boyagoda for the evening.
Okay, Randy Boyagoda is principal and vice president at St. Michael's College at University of Toronto, where he's also professor of English and holds the Basilian Chair in Christianity, Arts, and Letters. He is author of 5 books, including Richard John Newhouse, A Life in the Public Square, and Original Pren, which will be available today. It's his most latest novel, will be available after his talk. And it was named a Globe and Mail Best Book of 2018. He's a regular contributor to CBC Radio and to newspapers and magazines in Canada, the United States, and the UK, and he's chair of the 2019 Scotiabank Giller Prize jury. He lives in Toronto with his wife and 4 daughters.
Thank you very much, Dr. Duquette. Thank you to Jay and to the Sophia Society. It is great to be back here. And I say that by way of beginning these remarks with a necessary apology. The last time I was here, I have been told, I was loud, I cried, I threw a tantrum when I didn't get ice cream. This was in 1979, I should point out, when I was visiting with my family, the Sisters of St. Joseph, who I'm sure you all know used to be here in this beautiful space, in this beautiful building. So I'm not sure if anyone here was here in 1979 other than me.
I was.
Oh,
I cried too.
Oh, there you go. Okay, good. So we cried together.
Yeah.
That's usually how my talks go. We cry together. All right. So my talk. You can hear me fine. Yes. Okay. My talk this evening is called "The World is Charged with the Grandeur of God, but what about Toronto? Faith, fiction, and public life, here and now." I want to begin with a reading from Cardinal Newman that I think will frame my remarks for tonight, and then also what I hope will be a discussion thereafter. And so I think what I'll do, to give you a sense of things, is I'm going to spend the first part of my talk discussing the question of what it means for each of us, and I think that matters for each of us, to be mindful of the idea that the world is charged with the grandeur of God in Toronto. What does that mean? Then I'm going to say a little bit about how I have experienced and explored and tried to contribute to that very phenomenon through my own work. And then I'll end by pointing to perhaps the most recent evidence of that, which is a reading from my new novel. And thereafter you will all buy 12 copies of it. That was the deal, wasn't it, Natasha? I thought? Okay. She didn't disagree, everyone. Okay. But let me begin just to frame my remarks with the following from a sermon, a Lenten sermon from John Henry Newman. "A great number of men live and die without reflecting upon the state of things in which they find themselves. They take things as they come and follow their inclinations as far as they have the opportunity. They are guided mainly by pleasure and pain, not by reason, principle, or conscience, and they do not attempt to interpret this world, to determine what it means, or reduce it to what they see and feel to system. But when persons, either from thoughtfulness of mind or from intellectual activity, begin to contemplate the visible state of things into which they are born, then forthwith they can find it a maze and a perplexity. It is a riddle which they cannot solve. It seems full of contradictions and without drift. Why it is, and what it is to issue in, and how it is what it is, and how we come to be introduced into it, and what is our destiny, are all mysteries. In this difficulty, some have formed one philosophy of life and others another. Men have thought they had found the key by means of which they might read what is so obscure. 10,000 things come before us, one after the other, in the course of life. And what are we to think of them? What color are we to give them? Are we to look at all things in a gay and mirthful way, or in a melancholy way, in a desponding or a hopeful way? Are we to make light of life altogether, or to treat the whole subject seriously? Are we to make greatest things of little consequence, or least things of great consequence? Are we to keep in mind what is past and gone, or are we to look on to the future? Or are we to be absorbed in what is present? How are we to look at things? This is the question which all persons of observation ask themselves, and answer each in his own way. They wish to think by rule, by something within them, which may harmonize and adjust what is without them. Such is the need felt by reflective minds. Now let me ask, what is the real key? What is the Christian interpretation of this world? What is given us by revelation to estimate and measure this world by the event of this season, the crucifixion of the Son of God? This is the opening to one of Newman's Lenten sermons. And the reason why I wanted to begin my remarks today with this selection from Newman is I think it speaks very much to the purpose, in many ways, of the Sophia Society, of these very discussions. What does it mean to be capable and willing to pursue unnecessary thought? And just think about that as one concept. Unnecessary thought. By one measure, every time your phone beeps, you're told you don't have to, it's not necessary to think about anything, just react, respond to whatever that stimulus is. In a higher order way, there are endless opportunities for distraction, for consumption, to fill up space and not worry about things in any higher order way. So what does it mean to be capable of unnecessary thought? So here Newman is exploring that question, and then he suggests that for those who are aware and capable and willing to pursue unnecessary thought, well then a whole host of other challenges come out, right? By what standard? By what measure? With what focus? With what stakes? The key in all of this for believers is that there is an answer. What we would think of, as it were, as the scandal of particularity, right? The story of the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. That's the answer, and we have lots of questions, but these things don't map onto each other in any kind of straightforward way, today or at any other time, I would argue. So that leads then to, I think, the key question from Newman, which I think I'd like you all to kind of keep in mind as we kind of continue through this evening. How are we to look at things? How are we to look at things? By one measure, in a kind of late secular progressive moment, we live in quote-unquote godless Toronto, right? That all of the indicators, let's say, of public life in our city, and perhaps more broadly in Ontario or indeed in Canada, would suggest a retreat of religion from public life. At the same time, you could cite StatsCan or you could cite Pew studies that suggest two things. First, that still the majority of Canadians choose to self-identify as Christians of various kinds. A larger majority choose to identify as religious believers of, or members of a religion, perhaps more importantly, of some way, some kind. But if you look at things like the most recent major study of religious trends in Canada by Pew, the Pew Forum, a very good and trustworthy forum, which is about 5 years old now, there was a sense of a continued decline, which kind of maps to some degree on what's going on, let's say, in the larger North American context. So by those two measures, One could argue for a kind of retreat. By a straight demographic reading, you can understand things as, well, no, there's still a majority of people in this country, indeed in this city, who choose to identify as members of religious groups, as Christians. But neither of those, I would argue, is a satisfying way of understanding what it means for the world and for Toronto to be charged, as it were, with the grandeur of God, right? We turn instead to other indicators. And these indicators can take any number of forms, and I'll certainly suggest a few as we go on. But especially for the English majors in this crowd and for readers more generally, I would point out philosophy majors I'll get to eventually, I promise. But for the English majors, I would point to the great New York critic Lionel Trilling's definition of a novel. What does a novel give us? A novel gives us the hum and buzz of cultural implication. The buzz, the hum and buzz of cultural implication. In other words, we listen to stories for a sense of where is God's presence in the world as it is. I'll come back to that in a moment. In the meantime, consider this. We have, as believers, the who, the what, the why, in terms of how to answer certain questions. But how do we look at the world around us? We do so, I would argue, in three ways. We do so as individuals. We do so as an institution, whichever institution is. So Tyndale, as an institution, pursues these questions of how to look at the world around us, how to find, contribute to, reveal the grandeur of God, let's say, in the here and now in Toronto. And we do so communally. Aristotle defined politics as the effort to determine how we ought to order our common life together. Ought, the ethical imperative. Not should, could, would, but how we ought to order our common life. That's the purpose of politics. Where and how should faith and religion figure in that ought? How, again, right? Where does that come in? It's a question that I would argue we all face in three contexts: as individuals, as members of larger communities, whether it's family, whether it's church, and then also, of course, in an institutional context. This is a question for me in multiple contexts, and I would argue that I've been actively aware of it in unexpected ways since I came to Toronto in 2006, since I came back to Toronto. I grew up in Oshawa. I went to school downtown at U of T. From there, I went to graduate school in Boston and then did a postdoc in Notre Dame before returning to Toronto in 2006 for a job at Ryerson. When I returned, I met any number of friends, colleagues, who all said the same thing. Randy, you need to choose. It's either or. Either you're a Ryerson English professor, or you're a serious, committed Catholic engaging the world around you. It can't be both. And I rejected that. I rejected it because it didn't sound right, it didn't feel right vocationally, and it struck me as an abdication of responsibility in a lot of ways. So that if I can give you kind of my first provisional answer to the question, to Newman's question of how, it's always both and rather than either or. Okay? Think about it that way. It's a both and answer in terms of engaging the world around you and then also being true to and living out your faith. How is always the question, but it's both and rather than either or. The great challenge with such matters, I think, is integration, is a willingness to integrate those parts of your life that we might think of in sacred terms with those parts of your life that you might think of in secular terms. And it's being open to moments in our life around us here in Toronto where that plays itself out. So I'll give you a very recent example that I experienced. I have made eye contact with John Tory twice in the last month. My big claim to fame. It's a very nice introduction, but there you go. That's what I'm especially proud of today. The second one was this past Monday. Mayor Tory was at the University of Toronto for the announcement of a $100 million gift to the University of Toronto to open an innovation center downtown that's going to focus on the relationship between technology, ethics, society. It's very exciting. It's a very exciting announcement. And he was there along with assorted other dignitaries. And, you know, there was a moment when he was walking by where we made eye contact. And I would like to think, who knows how many people Mayor Tory sees in a given day. But I'd like to think he was a little confused for a moment when he saw me because of the last time and place where I saw him, which was the church basement at Corpus Christi Parish on Pancake Tuesday, on Shrove Tuesday, where Mayor Tory showed up to kind of chat with us while we were eating pancakes in the basement of the church, as happens, you know, on kind of every Shrove Tuesday or Pancake Tuesday. Reflect for a moment on the ease of understanding Toronto's public life as one or the other of those two experiences. But then reflect on what it means to find a way to order those and integrate them, to have a full understanding of the mayor's role in this city. And the mayor's role in this city is what? To come to U of T for a big announcement. The mayor's role in U of T, in this city is to go to Corpus Christi, to an East End parish, and hang out in the basement and eat some pancakes. It's, again, both and, but we have to make the decision to see it that way, right? And I think, again, it's easier to imagine an either or. The challenge, I think, for most of the people that I think are in this room right now would be, for a great majority of the people that we might know, it's usually an either or. You would see the mayor in one context or another, but for a kind of engaged public participant in Toronto's life, for an engaged citizen who's also a religious believer, you demonstrate the both and. Do you see, by virtue of your very movement through these otherwise discrete worlds? So it's, again, upon you. What's the how in that case? The willingness to move between these worlds and then make eye contact with the mayor when you need to. So there's that. That would seem like a kind of idiosyncratic example, and there are any number of them. But they speak to what? To the importance of integration. Again, both and rather than either or. And then comes the great temptation. What is the great temptation? If only things were like they used to be. If only we were living in fill in the blank, where apparently it's perfect and amazing. We can always point to evidence elsewhere, geographically and historically, where it was easier to answer the question of how to integrate your faith life with your public life. But I think that's cheap nostalgia, and I think it's dangerous. One of the things that I do with my students in almost every beginning class, every opening class I teach, I ask them to imagine the situation of a woman living in a village in England 1,000 years ago. And then I invite them to describe what she would envy about our lives here and now. And then I ask them to describe what we envy about her life. Any suggestions from the crowd? What do you think? What would she envy about our lives? Any suggestions? Any guesses? Conveniences. Health.
Women can vote.
Sorry?
Women can vote.
Women can vote, yes.
Maybe access to education.
Access to education. All things that she would certainly envy.
Pants.
Pants. Yeah, pants are amazing, I agree. Anything else? Much better Wi-Fi today, I think. Okay, now flip it for a second. What do you envy about her life?
Simplicity.
Simplicity. What else? Community. What else? Skirts? Is that what you're going to say? No? Tradition. Yeah, at the back?
Maybe less stress.
Less stress. So like simplicity, less stress. Anything else we'd envy about her life?
Maybe a Christian worldview.
A Christian worldview. Okay, so I'll pause there. And, you know, I've been sort of engaged with this exercise in multiple classes for years now. And often enough, the things that we would imagine she would envy about our life, it changes, to be honest, depending on the crowd. But generally speaking, security, mobility, health, pants is a new one, admittedly, but these sorts of things, voting, right? There's certain things that come up. But invariably, we all envy her simplicity and a lack of stress and a sense of community and a sense of tradition and belief. But why do we think that that's the case? Why do we think her life is any more simple than ours is, or any less stressful than ours is? Right? If you think about it for a moment, she would have faced any number of stresses that we wouldn't think about. And in some ways, there is a kind of a presumption that we would have that somehow her life is simpler than ours is, as opposed to recognizing that in her time and place, I suspect her life is probably pretty demanding, right? Everything within a certain set period of time, crops, marauding invaders, etc., a very restricted sense of mobility for endless reasons. There would have been stress and simplicity. But the other thing is Christian tradition and community. She would have had it in a small local context. Well, what do we have right here, right now? But a sense of community and tradition in a small local context. In other words, the challenge is to recognize continuities and connections, and then, as it were, to kind of resist the need for what? For thinking, if only we were then and there, this would all be easier. That's how you do it. You go back in time when everything was easier. It's not the case, I'm going to argue. Of course, in some broad ways, in some public ways, in historical ways, I grant that. But at the level of the individual, I think it would make more sense to imagine that there would have been endless challenges and opportunities then as now. And our temptation is what? To say, well, I would have been better about this if only it was 1,000 years earlier. But instead, I've traded my Christian responsibility in the here and now for a mess of pants, right? There is that, is that what it, no, pottage, it's pottage, not pants, but no? Catholic quoting the Bible, sort of? No, not that? Okay, so where I'm kind of trying to get to is that desire that we have to push off the question, how? To displace it, and in a sense kind of make excuses for ourselves. But I'm going to encourage you to reject the cheap consolation of the then and there for, frankly, the kind of the great adventure of the here and now. To recognize that you're not alone in pursuing the answer to the question, how, in the here and now, and that question's answers have an ultimate answer, if we think about how Newman's passage ended. But in the meantime, there's a vocational question. Whether you are a philosophy major, an English major, a churchgoer, a seminary student, in any context, every single person in this room has to answer the same question again and again. How am I called to draw on my talent to live out a meaningful life for self, God, and other in this place at this time? What am I supposed to do with the time and talent I have been granted in the here and now? And that answer, I would suggest to you, is one that you cannot put off or explain away with nostalgia for another period that probably wasn't what we actually think it was. Now, here I am saying what I think you all should do. What have I been doing? So let me explain a little bit by way of that. I pursue this very question as the principal of the Catholic College at the University of Toronto, as a professor in the English department at the University of Toronto, and as a writer, as a husband, and as a father. And the challenge, folks, in all that is integration, right? To integrate all of those components as opposed to forgetting 2 of the 3, forgetting 3 of the 4, forgetting 1 of the 5. What does it mean to integrate those? As the principal of St. Michael's College, I think it's living out the great promise that is St. Michael's, which I'll just encapsulate in one story for you. Etienne Gilson was the preeminent medievalist of the 20th century. He was a professor at the Sorbonne in the 1930s, and he sensed something about Europe. in the 1930s. He could tell things weren't going in a good direction in Europe at that point. And he was given 2 invitations to lecture in North America. One was at the University of Toronto and the other was at Harvard. Joseph came, he lectured in Toronto, he lectured at Harvard. And then he was offered jobs at Harvard and in Toronto. And Joseph chose Toronto over Harvard because of St. Michael's. Because he wanted both a research university experience and a Catholic collegiate community. Both and rather than either or. That led to the founding of the Pontifical Institute for Medieval Studies, the preeminent place for the study of the Middle Ages for decades in North America, and recognized indeed around the world. And in terms of the work that I do now as the principal of St. Michael's, I seek ways to make the case for the both and. That you can be serious about the life of faith and the life of the mind at the University of Toronto and as a member of St. Michael's College. I do so as a professor there, teaching something called the Gilson Seminar in Faith and Ideas, which explores ecology, science, politics, and the arts through the Catholic intellectual tradition, both in Toronto and then with a 2-week trip to Rome. And in all of that, 2 questions always come up. And I'll be curious how they would play out in a Tyndale context as well. And it speaks in some ways to my research, which I'll get to in a moment on my way to original print. At the beginning of the Gilson Seminar, I say to my students, I ask them a question. I say, how many of you think the Sistine Chapel is only for Catholics? And no one puts a hand up. Now, the Sistine Chapel, as I'm sure you know, has a very precise and technical function in the life of the Catholic Church with respect to the election of a pope. But no one thinks, oh, that's only for Catholics. The Sistine Chapel, its art, the politics, the beauty, the public function of that chapel exceeds a confessional context. It is publicly available. That's not an either or, it's a both and. It's also the place where the Pope is elected, right? It's both that place and it's this place that's publicly available. And so I encourage students to think in the both and way that way. And then I make one request of the students in the class who come from a diverse set of backgrounds, but for anyone in that class who happens to be a believer, I suggest you're not allowed to begin any sentence as a Christian or as a Catholic, because that's the autobiographical fallacy. Because now you are making the case that you should agree with me, not based on the inherent logic and reason of my statement, but based upon my identity and my understanding in confessional terms, which you may or may not share. And so I suggest what's required is a publicly available account. A publicly available account. It can absolutely be informed by your own beliefs, but they have to come into contact with more than your own beliefs and the beliefs of everyone else around you. Publicly available account. That phrase comes from the work of Richard John Newhouse. To switch now again to kind of how I have been able to kind of pursue this work. As Dr. Duquette mentioned, one of the books that I have published is a biography of Richard John Newhouse. Richard John Newhouse was born in 1936. He died in 2009. And when he died, he was arguably the leading religious intellectual in American public life. He was a counselor to presidents and to popes. He marched with Martin Luther King. He had lunch with John Paul II in the hills of Rome. He met with every American president from the late 1960s through to the Bush administration. And he was born in Pembroke, Ontario, and he never finished high school. It's an amazing story. And it's a story that is all about the here and now moments of his life and how to demonstrate the presence of God to the people around him, whether it was in New York, Rome, Pembroke, St. Louis, all the many places he lived. He was always available and engaged in vocational terms. His most important book is called The Naked Public Square, Religion and Democracy in America. It was published in 1984, just in the middle of the 1984 presidential election. And it was a book that made any number of cases against the abandonment of faith in the public square, and we hear a lot about that. But it's just as hard on Christian attempts to engage public life that were not publicly available, that were based upon sectarian arguments, basically. He rejects both and suggests that people of faith should be allowed to contribute to the public square, but that they should do so in a way that is, again, publicly available. Because these ideas are inherently good and true, as opposed to dependent upon an individual's belief system. I mean, especially for the philosophy majors in this room, I don't need to tell you sort of where that kind of goes intellectually, philosophically, and conceptually. I spent many years writing that biography. And I'll tell you, by the end of it, I was sick of being in someone else's life. That was an intense experience, at the end of which I found myself thinking about my own vocation as a writer in a very different way. And then that leads to my new novel, which is set partly here in Toronto and then elsewhere. And I thought maybe as the final component of this part of our time together, and then we can turn to some discussion, I'd explain why my new novel is about a bike-riding Sri Lankan Catholic English professor living in downtown Toronto, working at a failing Catholic college in the heart of the city, who has a sweet wife and 4 daughters. Yeah, a little bit, no? My first novel was about a genocidal African warlord who moves to Canada. My second novel was about a Sri Lankan village man who has 3 wives and 16 children. And then there's this book. So I've always written autobiographical fiction, as you can tell. But what I've done, more seriously, is I decided after writing a biography to write about experience, ideas, and faith from a perspective very close to my own. To raise the stakes, in a sense. Again, to do what? To seek integration. So the novel absolutely has a main character whose life and experiences I could imagine inhabiting. And it's a way for me then to pose questions about what it means to lead a good and religious and meaningful life in the here and now and still be fully a member and contributor to the world around you. Before I read to you from the novel, I just want to give you a sense of where it came from, the inspiration for it, beyond what I just suggested. I was at a lecture a few years ago now, I guess. And I was just sitting, just like this, listening to someone speak. And the person speaking, this is an older building, distinguished university, and they're speaking from a podium, big old oaken podium, a kind of grand podium. And at the heart of the podium was a bare, bright space. A bare, bright space. The whole thing was kind of dark and old and wooden, and then this really bright, bare space in the middle of it. And I'm staring at that, and I got to thinking, well, what happened there? As writers, you're curious, right? What happened there? What happened there? And then I thought, I'll bet there used to be a crest on that podium. And I'll bet that crest was probably religious, was probably Christian in some way. And this is a university that wasn't really any longer kind of self-identifying as a Christian university or a religiously affiliated university. So what happened? They pried the crest off, but then in a kind of striking demonstration of what secular progressivism can offer, what was there? A bare, bright space, right? They offered nothing else. It was flat. There was nothing there, but that thing wasn't there anymore. So I sat there, staring at that. And the thought came to me, what would happen if you were a religious believer teaching at that university? What would you do? What would you do if you found out that university is going to shut down? How would you respond to that situation? Fast forward a few weeks. I'm in Milwaukee for Christmas. My wife's from Milwaukee. We have lots of traditions in Milwaukee for Christmas. The most important one is that at 10 o'clock every night, we watch the nightly local news with my mother-in-law. This is almost as important as Mass. If she sees this on YouTube, I'm in big trouble for saying that. But every night we watch the nightly news. Watching the nightly news one night, and there's a special about an American military veteran who has decided, having served in the Middle East, he's come home, he's decided to go back to the Middle East by himself to fight ISIS. He's convinced that religious minorities are in a terrible way, and he's going to do something about this himself by going to the Middle East to fight ISIS. So what did I see there and he was a husband and a father. There's another example of someone trying to figure out how to live out his faith in the world at large. Just like that professor sitting in a lecture hall staring at a podium with a bare, bright space. So the writer in me thought, what would happen if those two people became one? What would happen if this professor realizes that his university is going to shut down unless it opens a satellite campus in the Middle East? And then because he doesn't want to be on curriculum committee, he volunteers to be on the committee to open up the satellite campus, and he goes to the Middle East thinking he's going to do something for his faith. What would happen then? Well, what would happen then is Original Print, is the novel that I published earlier this academic year, and from which I'm going to read in a moment. I realize, though, that before doing that, I'm switching gears rather strongly from my interest in religion and public life to my work as a novelist. What is the continuity there? Discerning what it means to be both engaged in the world around us and contributing out of my own gifts. That's the how. I'd be very happy to go right into the reading or to take questions on the other things first. Any of you, what do we think? Do we want me to do the reading first, or do you want questions first? Reading? Okay, the host is saying reading. Okay, I'll go right into the reading then, and then we'll go from there. So think about how I might, how I'm trying, I guess you could say, to do this in the novel. So I'm going to read to you from the beginning of the novel. This is from Original Print. New Year's Day. 8 months before he became a suicide bomber, Prin went to the zoo with his family. Puffy and brightly balaclavaed, the 6 of them fanned across an empty parking lot. Ahead of them was a billboard advertising the zoo's newest additions. 2 furry gifts from China snuggled in the smiling Prime Minister's lap, chewing bamboo shoots that pointed in perilous directions. Prin experienced a sympathetic twinge in his own groin. This was the day to tell them. Prin and Molly had decided to stop calling it just a potty problem. He was going in for surgery later that January. The plan was to take the girls to one of the more obscure exhibits and explain it there and leave it there, in a place they would never visit again. Girls, something awful is growing inside your daddy. It's called cancer, and it looks like this. Mole rats. Blind, pink, splotchy, writhing, they lived in a stacked complex of glass tubes. Their lives were spent crawling and squeezing over each other, their dull, plump shapes pulsing and proliferating in low light. Who wouldn't want a very careful doctor with a super powerful robot assistant to cut all of these gross and pointless bodies out of their beloved zoo, their beloved dad? They would ask, when they cut it out, would he bleed like when he was shaving and yelling that they were late for church? What does prostate cancer look like? Does it bite? The forums he'd visited recommended finding something like mole rats when it was time to tell the kids. An evangelical from Naperville, Illinois posted that he drove his kids to the parking lot of a mosque in Southside Chicago to tell them. An hour later, he posted that Islam was a religion of peace. While the others debated this, Print image searched zoo animals until he found the blind mole rats of Toronto. But they never made it. Shortly after entering the zoo, wet snow began to wallop them. The family paid a fast visit to the African rhinoceros standing all by herself in a snow-covered concrete savanna in far eastern Toronto. She was wondering what the hell her parents were thinking when they decided to immigrate to Canada. By now, the rain had turned. The midday sky was pewter and thunder shook out from behind the trees. Could this be a sign? Was God using a winter weather event to tell him this was the perfect day to tell the girls? Or was he telling him to go home and keep them safe from bad roads and bad news? The sky also went dark and thunder sounded while Christ hung on the cross. But other than his mother, who would take him seriously for making that connection? He was no Christ. He was a 40-year-old associate professor of English with early-stage prostate cancer. Maybe we should just go home, Prince said. Whatever you think is best, dear, Molly said. But she always said that. Did she always mean it? After 12 years of marriage and now with this diagnosis and this snowed-out plan to tell the children, it felt to Prin too late, or too early to find out. Lemurs! Daddy! We can't go home yet. We need to toast the lemurs. Prin was surprised to find other people in the lemur house. He wouldn't have told them in here anyway, but he'd been hoping, given the weather, that they would have at least had the place to themselves. Instead, there was a family in there from out of town. The parents wore unendorsed running shoes and shapeless blue jeans. The dad had a neck beard and a bright blue, straight-billed Blue Jays cap that he wore in reverse. He was drinking from a giant bottle of bright purple Gatorade. The mom had spiky short hair and was chewing gum. dramatically. They were bickering over what looked like a flip phone. They had 3 children, twin little boys with rat tails running around with robot figurines, and an older girl with purplish hair who was standing off to the side with a novel Prynne recognized from that year's community reading exercise at his university. The book was a national bestseller about corruption-fighting vampires who were also Indigenous youth leaders. Thank you. Okay, girls, finish your snacks. Don't take off your coats. We're not staying long. Let's find the New Year lemon and have our toast. He pulled the sparkling juice from his bag. But by the time Prynne had very carefully, even ritually unfoiled the bottle and set up the little glasses, his own children were crowded around the other family's twins, all of them jockeying for more iPad. Molly was chatting with the other mom and nodding commiseratively. "Looks like it's just you and me for the bottle, eh, buddy?" said the other father. "Sorry? Oh, yeah, right," said Prynne. His heart was now beating hard with the sudden effort of remembering, in addition to the remarks he planned to deliver to his children about his cancer diagnosis, that day's college football games and the names of the different kinds of saws that he owned and how many cylinders were in his car's engine. Wait, was it pistons? "So, what are we drinking?" "Sparkling juice. Sorry, nothing alcoholic. It's kind of a thing we do every New Year's Day. We come to the zoo and raise a toast to the lemurs." "Yeah, my kids love that Disney movie too. Which one was it again?" "Sorry, I'm not sure." "I can't believe I can't remember the name of that movie either. We had it going on both screens in the van when we drove here." "So you're from out of town?" "Huh? Oh yeah. The library gives out free passes. Ours expired yesterday, but we took a shot and it worked out. Now we had a pretty late night, if you know what I mean, so I figured just bring the kids here and let them run around while I drink 50 gallons of Gatorade, right? It's all about the kids anyway, right? Even if I'm missing Oklahoma Notre Dame? Wait, crap. You think we're going to be stuck here till 8 o'clock? Maybe, eh? The weather's right fierce. They were calling it snowpocalypse on the news. Buddy, the best decision CNN ever made was giving Trump his own 24-hour weather show after all that stuff happened and he got fired or fired himself or whatever. I still don't understand that situation. Do you? Well, if you were to ask Theodore Adorno, who does he play for, Notre Dame? He was a thinker about the culture. Which culture? Actually, that's a very good question. 100%. It's all about everyone needing to have the right phone, right? Anyways, you got 4 kids, eh? All girls, still trying for the boy, right? I hear that. After we had the twins, I got the snip. I'm Shane, by the way. What's your name? What are you, some kind of doctor? I know this guy from Bangla. Wait, I think he's from Bangla something. Hey, Alana, where's Jagditch from? It starts Bangla. Suddenly, there was a loud snapping noise, and the lights went out. Through one of the big windows, you could see sparks jumping up and around. They were coming out of a black cable flailing around on the snow-covered ground. "Cool, Daddy, look," one of Prynne's daughters said. Now they were all standing in the dark, staring out at a gray storm that had turned into thick, pinning rain. In the sudden quiet that even the children observed, you could really hear it hammering on the roof of the lemur house. Prynne wondered what they were doing in there, the lemurs. Were they still swinging around on knotty, low-slung ropes, or were they lolling on their thick rubber furniture, peeling oranges and napping and snuggling themselves with their own tails and making his daughters wish they could live like lemurs too? Were those glossy black eyes tracking everything the whole time? Were they pondering why no one was toasting them? Or were they trying to figure out who was dropping all those marbles and nails on their sudden nighttime sky? When was he supposed to tell the children? There had been a plan. A good plan, a prayed about and well-researched plan. He felt cheated. He had long since accepted the fear and the pain that had come with his diagnosis. He knew this was real. He also knew that what was real for him was small compared to what was real fear and pain for so many others. But he knew this was real too, his portion. And all he wanted from God in the world was 5 minutes with his kids in front of some blind mole rats. They had defied the Trumpian weather and come to the zoo, and the plan had fallen apart. What did God expect him to do instead? "I think you should talk to Shane," Molly said. "About what?" said Prynne. "Alana had breast cancer. It's in remission now." "Oh, is that what you were talking about before the power went out?" "Yes. And he might have some advice about how to tell the kids." "Molly, I have a plan for how to tell the kids, remember?" "The children know something's wrong, Prynne. You need to tell them. Your surgery's only a few weeks away, and they can tell I'm worried about something, about you. But I've said nothing because I know you're trying to be careful and thoughtful with the news. Only the plan's not working out the way you want it. So do something else. Talk to Shane or play with the kids while you can. Do something else. Don't just stand there looking at your dead phone." "Excuse me, Shane. Can I get some advice about something?" Shane and Alana told their kid she had breast cancer by driving all the way to downtown Toronto, paying $20 for parking, and then sitting down to a sushi dinner. Shane had looked at the same website that Prin had. They were crying anyway because of that green wasabi stuff you put on it. So that's when we told them. Wasabi. Killers for sure. Totally works. Good luck to you in your situation, buddy. You got some great girls there. They're so smart. I don't know half the words they're saying. And I'm going to cut my goatee and stuff back to rock a mustache for you next November, 100%. You're going to beat this. You should friend me so I can show you my stash. Thanks, Shane. They fist bumped. Shane cleared his throat and cracked his neck left, then right. Look, can I give you some advice? Sure, Prince said. Life is a highway, right? But at some point, we all hit a deer. And what do you hope? I'm not sure, said Prin. You hope you hit a fawn or at least a doe. Not too much damage, and if you can field dress by the side of the road, you got a freezer full of meat for your trouble. That's the best situation. What's the worst? Hitting a moose? Said Prin. Shane stepped back like someone had spattered paint in his face. He blinked violently. Whoa, I never thought of that. I guess the moose is like, well, death. Both men went quiet. I need to go back and think about that one, buddy. But anyway, I don't think you're in a hitting a moose situation with prostate cancer. It's more like you hit a buck. That's where I was going. Fawn and doe, okay, but a buck? Let's say you hit a buck. Wait, are you still following me? Yes, Prince said. So, hitting a buck's not death, but it's still a lot of damage, right? And you can sort of give up or you can still get something out of the situation. And here's the thing, it's buck meat. You ever eat buck meat? No, said Prin. It's tough, like living with cancer right now. Indeed, said Prin. So that's where your girls get them fancy words from, said Shane. Daddy, come see, it's raining on the Lemmers. Moments later, a branch came down on the see-through ceiling of the Lemmer house. Panels gave way and fell with a great crash of broken glass and ice. The branch itself dangled and dripped down through the opening. The Lemmers stared up at the rain now pouring straight down into their world. Now, where was that coming from? And what was this new black and green climb me thing that had poked through and was now beckoning? One of the Lemmers was creative and curious enough to climb up and find out. It grabbed onto a long, thick rope leading from one play structure to the next and swung towards the sudden opening in the heavens, ignoring all the humans below, banging on the viewing glass and screaming, "It wasn't worth it! It wasn't worth it!" Glancing back from the hard weather, the Lemmer paused, then scooted up and slipped out. Prin ran to the door to block the children from going outside to save the Lemmer, and from there saw a furry black ball fall back inside. Everyone screamed, then cheered. The Lemmer had caught hold of a rope and saved its own life. Happy New Year! He was going to beat cancer! He would tell them right now. He made his way over to Molly and the girls, but before he could reach them, there was more banging on the glass and pleading because the Lemmer wasn't curious or creative. It was just a trapped animal. It climbed up again, scrambling along the black, wet bark of the fallen branch. A new rope slipped down beside it. It grabbed the new rope, only this time it wasn't a rope. The Lemmer falls a second time. The Lemmer shrieked and shrieked before letting go of the broken wire and falling a very long way, pinwheeling a little. It landed near the glass and ice. The sound was loud, sudden, over. They couldn't actually see the body because all the other Lemmers had gathered around to grieve, or maybe they were just curious. Prin walked over to his own grieving and freaked out family. Shane gave him 2 thumbs up and nodded. They'd never come to the Lemmer house again. And what a small price that was to pay, Prin thought. He suddenly felt a tremor of love, of being loved and cared for well past his knowing. All of them loved and cared for well beyond themselves. They weren't curious and creative and trapped in fallen animals. They each of them counted for far more than Lemmers and sparrows. There could be no better time or place to tell them. He had trusted only in himself. How trapped and false and grasping he had been. God had a greater plan than any one of Prin's. And now, at last, in his mercy, girls, listen up! Your dad's got cancer of the privates. But don't worry, he's totally gonna kill this buck. I believe in him. You have to believe in him. We all have to believe in him. Thanks, Shane, said Prin. Indeed. Hey, who's using the fancy words now, right? They fist bumped a second time. Thank you. So happy to take questions about religion, public life, and buckmeat. Wherever you want to go next.
Yeah, we're gonna field some questions, send it out to everyone if they have anything. I'll start off first while everyone formulates what they'd like to ask. You mentioned, first of all, that when you came to Ryerson for the first time, you had a friend that told you that you could either be an English professor there, or you could still be a practicing Catholic. And I was wondering, at that point, I imagine that was kind of a newer idea, and how at that point did you react and decide how you're going to move forward into where you are now?
Well, it wasn't be a practicing Catholic. I think there was no expectation I couldn't otherwise, but that there had to be a way to be successful in a very secular context. In order for that to be the case, I would have to somehow leave aside my faith commitments, rather than find ways to draw on them in publicly available ways. Right? And I think that was what I discerned, and I think there was two parts to this. The first was through the work, right? Just writing and researching and teaching in ways that made sense and in which one could demonstrate the distinctive, irreducible goods of drawing on faith commitments in support of your teaching, your research, your scholarship. That's the one. And then the other is just disposition, right? It's making the decision to live out a kind of a, if it makes sense as a word, to kind of live out your kind of the joyful parts of more Easter Sunday than Good Friday makes sense, I guess you could say, right? As a way to kind of be present to the world around you. That instead of apologetics. Apologetics, I don't think are what would have worked in that context in which I found myself. And then, I applied for 99 jobs coming out of graduate school. The job I got was at Ryerson, of all places. It's a wonderful place. I had a great time there. And so the question isn't, okay, I'll just wait till I get to St. Mike's and then suddenly it'll be easy to be a Catholic. But no, instead it would be, I'm going to probably get in trouble for that one too, but instead it would be how here and now do you find a way to do it? And then, again, identify continuities and inspiration. Yes, at the back.
So at the beginning of your talk, you had the quote from Newhouse that went something along the lines of deciding whether to look at serious things lightly or light things seriously. I can't remember exactly. But having written original print, where I've read it, and it's obviously very humorous and has a lot of levity to it, but also a lot of really heavy, intense stuff as well. How much of that frame that is looked at through original print, autobiographical, I guess, like how much do you look at the world through those serious and light frames, I guess?
That was amazing. I mean, we worked on that before, and the way you didn't even use notes for that. That was remarkable. Thank you. It's an excellent question. I would say, and I say this certainly to anyone in the room that wants to write someday, each book, religious, otherwise, each book kind of gives you a sense of how you ought to write it when you realize what the story is. When you realize what the story is that you want to tell, the nature of the book kind of reveals itself. So what does it mean with this case? When I submitted the original manuscript of the novel to my editor, he called me and he said, "Congratulations, Randy, you have written a very funny and smart comic novel. The problem is it's taken you 600 pages to do it." This was 600 pages in its original form. And he said to me, did I lost my watch somehow?
It's right on your floor.
I've lost track of time. Thank you. And I said, what are you talking about? Every word of these 600 pages is just gold, solid gold, which is why it's very heavy manuscript. And he disagreed. And what he told me was, don't do anything. Don't touch your manuscript. Don't edit it. Don't do anything. And instead, he put me on a reading diet. He said, you think you're writing a John Irving novel, one of these kind of big, browsing, kind of man-about-the-world adventure books. And you're not. You're writing a mid-century English comic novel along the lines of Kingsley Amis, Evelyn Waugh, etc., etc. But don't believe me, believe them. So he said, don't do anything, and he gave me a list of novels that I was supposed to read. And he said, read these, and they were a series of 200-page novels that were kind of religiously engaged and comic and kind of fast-paced. And he said, is that what you're trying to do, or is it this other thing? And I said, no, that's what I'm trying to do. He said, okay, we'll get rid of 400 pages then. And so that gave me a context, a tradition, and a sense of continuity and other kind of models to then figure out where to be serious, where to be funny. I mean, the nature of satire is to be both serious and funny, to find ways to kind of bring them together. But it also speaks to, I think, the basic premise of the kind of the Christian proposition, which is, it is Easter Sunday in the end, right? It's Good Friday and Easter Sunday. It's the divine comedy, right? There's a kind of joyfulness imprinted in the great drama of salvation. And so in my way, I'm trying to do that with this novel. Any other questions? There's one other person I wrote a question for before we got here, remember? Who was it? No? Just kidding. Yes?
How many man hours went into that book?
How many person minutes went into my book? Let me see. The novel itself I wrote quickly, but the editing took a lot longer. To give you a sense of things, and again, in the both and context, this is part of a trilogy, so I'm working on the second novel right now. So I get up at about 4 o'clock in the morning every day, and I write for 2 hours, and then my wife and 4 children get up, and the day kind of combusts into itself. And then I go to school, and I work as a college principal and professor until about 2:30 in the afternoon. Then I take a nap on my desk for about 10 minutes. Public knowledge, no problem. And then I continue on with the rest of my day. I use that time because, and again, this is advice for any aspiring writer, never, ever, ever say that someday you're going to write a novel, because then you someday will never write a novel, right? Always write in the here and now. How can I live out this gift in the here and now? So I suspect my wife probably has a very full sense of how many hours I've spent on this, but generally I just find time in a way that I almost said in a way that doesn't have any effect upon my family life, but I couldn't actually say that because, like with the Emperor, when the Emperor, and he started doing that, right when I started saying that, I got, from Star Wars, I can feel her when Vader does that, right? Not that my wife is Darth Vader. Oh, that's number 3 I'm going to get in trouble for tonight. But anyway, I try to find ways to integrate these things into family time, professional time, and creative time to come together. Yes?
Thank you very much for your presentation, Randy. I think my question stroke comment follows on from the practice that you've just described in terms of paying attention to your different roles, but all part of the same vocation. Because you mentioned that part of how we, as believers, listen to the stories, work out how to live with a sense of God's purpose. You mentioned 3 domains in which we do that, or places, spaces. You mentioned the individual, the institutional, and the communal. And I just wanted to ask you to comment a little bit more on the relationship between those, where we might see the tensions between those. I can imagine the individual getting eclipsed quite easily, or vice versa.
I think it's recognizing the irreducible reality of each of those entities, and that we are part of multiple entities all at the same time. Life would be so much easier if you were just one and you ignored the rest, right? Life would be so much easier if everyone lived out their institutional, individual, and communal practices exactly the same way, or the way you wanted them to, says a college principal. But in fact, it's kind of a boring and impossible idea, right? That's a myopic idea. And so I think acknowledging that there are overlaps and that there is tension and unity, and I'll explain that in a moment, between these 3 categories is important. The great Jesuit phenomenologist Bernard Lonergan had this concept, tension and unity. And his point was that that was his kind of diagnosis or account of the modern human person, that the postmodernists might tell us we are a heap of fragments, nothing fits together, don't worry about it. But and kind of in a deep way, at the end of the day, when you're lying in bed at night, you want things to fit together. You want things to make sense. But it's romantic to think that they would perfectly fit together, or that they did way back when in some perfect way. and that the call and the responsibility and the challenge of living at the drama of human life today is acknowledging tension and unity between your life as an individual, as a member of an institution, and as a member of multiple communities. And acknowledging the tension, living with the tension, that's what we all are kind of called to do with and for each other, and acknowledging as much. Any other questions?
Can I ask a supplementary?
Yeah, absolutely, because if another 10 minutes, then there's no way I have to help put the kids to bed tonight because I'll be too late for that. So I'm totally fine with that. Go ahead.
I'm an outdoor photographer.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, I'm standing atop of the Niagara Escarpment in the dead of winter, ice coating the escarpment rock along the shoreline. I'm trying to capture the magic of the sun playing off that glistening ice. It's 50 below zero Fahrenheit. I don't notice it. I don't notice the passage of time. I'm so keen on capturing the essence of that magic.
Mm-hmm.
Do you notice the passage of time when you're writing this
That's a
book?
good question. Mm-hmm. I certainly do it in warmer circumstances. Let's begin there. My wife and children have pointed out that I hold my breath when I'm writing. And I don't know that I do that. But they can tell I'm writing because I hammer on the keyboard and I hold my breath, which sounds like a child having a temper, right? But apparently this is really how I write my poetry. This is how I work. I see it in a different way, though, to be honest. I'm in the middle of writing the second book in the trilogy, and I mean, really in the middle of writing it as we speak. And I was on campus a couple of days ago, and I ran into a colleague who I know, who I work with on a daily basis, and I couldn't remember her name because I was so far inside my novel in an otherwise maybe not that exciting committee meeting. I kind of forgot where I was, and I couldn't remember her name, and I thought, am I having a stroke? Because it makes no sense. And then I realized, no, I'm so far inside the world of the successor to this book that I had trouble kind of coming back out of it, I guess you could say. Yes?
So thank you so much for your talk.
You're
I
welcome.
really enjoyed it. I was wondering if you could speak a little more about the joy of Easter Sunday that you touched on. One thing in my own kind of engagements, so I'm a graduate student at U of T and in a very secular environment. When I think about how do I engage and how do I bring my faith to these interactions, I realize that one tendency I have is fear. I'm afraid of being judged by fellow students, professors, if I speak about my faith or even the sort of flavor that faith has, even if I'm not using those words necessarily. And one posture I can make in response is to kind of retreat, to simply stay silent. Another one is to be very kind of defensive and aggressive, but I realize that meeting, yes, there are going to be challenges, and yes, there are going to be people are going to disagree and sometimes be hurtful and things like that. But if I can find the joy of the gospel in that, it just changes the encounter. So maybe I'm answering my own question.
Yeah, really nice job.
But I'm wondering if you have
Classic grad student move right there.
I'm wondering if you have any additional comments.
Sure, I'll offer two. Do you like basketball?
Yes.
LeBron James versus Steph Curry. If you watch LeBron James play he's an amazing basketball player, but it's all about LeBron, and he's struggling constantly. You can see it on his face. He's upset, he's tempestuous. It's all about LeBron and the struggle to be LeBron James, whether it's Cleveland or Miami or Cleveland or Los Angeles. Then watch Steph Curry. Steph Curry plays basketball with joy. He's a great basketball player, but you watch him, he's having fun doing it. He's really good at it, but he's having fun doing it. And he's far more of a team player than LeBron is. I would argue that our model should be Steph Curry, not LeBron, in a sense, right? That the world kind of expects LeBron, but actually it's more fun to be Steph Curry. And Steph Curry, more people like watching Steph Curry play basketball, I would say. that's one example. That's one way to think about it. The other way is to realize how much, usually, we are projecting. And that people tend to be far more reasonable and far more understanding and far less surprised than we think, right? Where we have these kind of internal mini Augustinian dramas of revelation and withholding, and people can tell, and they're probably pretty fine with it. And there's probably a lot of people in their worlds who are in their own family lives that you'd see a kind of, they know about faith, they themselves might come from there, from a tradition. My moment of this was as a graduate student. I was at a conference, and we ended up going to a historic church, as English professors do. Oh, let's go look at the architecture. And so we were kind of looking at the church, but it was a church, and I wanted to pray. And I had this kind of rich Augustinian drum. When do I do this? How do I have to bear witness? No, I don't want to show anyone. Anyway, blah, 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 blah. Eventually, the group all went one way, and I thought, perfect. So then I went and I knelt before the altar, and then they all came right back and saw me. And I'm brown, so I didn't go red, so it was fine, right? But I felt a little embarrassed, to be honest. And then I got on the bus, and one of the older professors walked by me, and she said, Randy, my church, at least, we have kind of comfy cushions that we get to sit on, right? This is just all hardwood, right? And then she just kept on walking, but it was telling me something, right? And she did it with a grace and an ease, and then just went and sat down, and we didn't talk about anything else. But it told me, you're not alone, and stop being such a moron about this, right? It's not that big a deal, unless you behave like it's a big deal. There are moments when, of course, it is a big deal, where there are kind of real challenges, but by and large, no. People, as long as you do it in a way that's reasonable, realistic, and that's more Steph than LeBron, I think it works out. You're welcome. Any other questions?
Again, I'd like to thank Randy Boyagoda, Dr. Randy Boyagoda, for being here today. If we could all give him a round of applause.
Thank you.
We will be selling his book in the Stiller Lounge, and if you need directions, it's right over there. Some of our members will be there to direct you over there. We'll be selling his book. There's some refreshments, some high-class stuff, very good. I think you'll all like it. So, if we can close off the evening now, I'd like to thank you all for coming here. Again, we're the Sophia Society, and we really appreciate you all coming out. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. DeKepe.